and they did a lot of that too with Couple Station and so forth. Then you go into those areas and you get tax credits to redevelop the warehouses. So that's that's been a lot of what they've been doing in St. Louis, including with building the lofts. Now again, the lofts aren't selling, and the poverty issues necessarily aren't going away, and also you're not having a incredibly large net gain happening in St. Louis. There has been some net gain of jobs and also people coming into St. Louis, but it's really talked about in that urban core, which is really only about 12,000 people when you talk about the legitimate downtown residential, and I think that's gone up in the last 5 years or so about 8 or 9%. So yes, you've seen an increase, but when you're talking about the increase on the number of 12,000 people, it's a lot different than talking about the entire city number or the entire county number.
Now, when they start to talk, and I know we've discussed this before, and it's something we'll just briefly get into, because you always measure sort of economic growth or economic activity. There's always economic activity, but it doesn't necessarily mean that's the same thing as economic growth. So you have economic growth in one area, which means you're simply taking it away from another. Right. So you might see a decline in complete landing area if there was sort of increased activity around the ballpark. Right, you're just reallocating monies. The true test of economic development is, like you're saying, is bringing in revenue that wasn't there before, and then turning it over repeatedly locally. So unless you're bringing in money that wasn't already there, then you're really not having any net economic gain. It's the easiest way to look at it, and particularly, especially if you're only moving it from one area to another. So when you're really talking about the stadium, you're talking about a small area, and that area could be affecting other areas. Now, if you have a vital city that has the additional money, that's craving the extra spending, or is capable of supporting it, then it's not an issue. Then you can have the landing, you can have these other places like Washington Avenue coincide. But when you don't have that in St. Louis, particularly with the residential population, then it's a very hard sell. And so that's a lot of what's been going on down in the St. Louis area, and that's another issue that's going to make it very hard to actually push this later on. And there have been a number of businesses that have gone under since the stadium, smaller businesses, since the stadium has come about. Now, is there some belief that this is going to increase the tax base? There is a belief that it's going to increase the tax base. Now, if you look at the numbers, and at least the numbers that have been provided by the Cardinals and also supported by public officials, you will find that there has been, because they abated the 5% amusement tax, which was a very strange tax. It's an additional tax. It's not on most major league sports franchises. It's on the sports franchises here, including the Rams and the Blues, but it's 5% additional that are just on ticket taxes, is the way to look at it. Now, when they got rid of that, the Cardinals actually were able to put more money back into the stadium for private financing, and to also then turn around and collect additional revenue. So the state is getting a very good return on their investment, as is the city and the county. Now, however, how does that actually affect the rest of the revenues in the area right now is up for debate. But there has been an increase, at least in tax money. The other issue with the Cardinals is, when you talk about new revenue coming in, most of the Cardinals' monies have been coming from about 40% of outside the city, and actually outside the state, I'm sorry. Only about 8% of city residents actually go to Cardinal games. So again, they were doing that in the old Busch. They're doing it in the new Busch. So what is the new actual economic activity or multiplier that's actually occurring? So it hasn't actually changed. The new stadium hasn't really affected in some way an economic growth pattern if you're having sort of the same proportion of city residents, outside residents, and people from, let's say, outside the city, but from Missouri. Correct. If anything, some people have said because of the lower capacity in the stadium, and it's hard to say this for sure right now, there's something that is going to need to be looked into, but if anything, you're probably actually having a harder time for outside residents to possibly come in. And because of the honeymoon effect on the new stadium, you might possibly be getting more St. Louisans and also county residents going to this stadium. So if anything, you may be decreasing the amount of tourism actually coming in because of the lack of, there's about 4,000 or 5,000 less seats. So that's another issue that needs to be looked at. But also as a city as a whole right now is having a hard time supporting itself in the other areas. So until you look at all that, it's very hard to say how much the Cardinals are actually impacting
new growth anyway. They're
So
certainly
the
having
4,000
an
or
effect.
5,000 less seats can have a significant impact.
Correct, correct. And the reason that the Cardinals did the less seats than they previously had is because they've said, quite frankly, Bill DeWitt, if you look at my dissertation, said, hey, look, we wanted the stadium to have another 4,000 or 5,000, but when you put us in this position on the public financing portion and didn't give us as much as we would have liked, we just had to cut back on seats. And he said that's unfortunate, but that's just the reality of the situation.
So if they'd received more state money or more city money or more combination city and county money, you might have had a stadium that's a little bit different, fitting in those 4,000 or 5,000.
Right. You probably would have a stadium that originally was proposed to have another 5,000 or 6,000 seats. The other issue is, and they talk a lot about it in different books, is you had a lot of money that, as usual, when they got behind schedule or when they had to rush the stadium, ended up costing more. So that's another issue too. If the stadium had stayed on point, then maybe you could add those additional 5,000 or 6,000 seats. But as everybody knows when they look at these issues, you never actually stay on the bid. And they always accept the lowest bid, but once you accept the lowest bid, then suddenly there's cost overruns. Yeah. And that's what happened. Now, they would have had no problem building those 4,000 or 5,000 extra seats if the cost overruns hadn't happened, really. So that's another issue.
Was the cost overrun significant on this stadium?
Well, originally I think it was proposed to be about $300 million. It's hard to say. You get a lot of different figures on it. Even Bill DeWitt gives a number of about $400 million. Other people that look at it will say that stadium cost $425 million. Other people will say it costs $375. But there's definitely were more costs than Bill DeWitt originally thought, and than any figure I've seen. Now the exact overlays could be anywhere, I'd say probably 50 or 60 or 70 million, but it's hard to say because you can't get an exact starting cost based upon the numbers, and again, that has a lot to do with the multipliers that are even used on those costs.
Yeah, the multipliers, this is something just to briefly explain to people, is that you're always sort of assuming that if I put $1 in, how much do I get additional? Am I getting an additional $1 more or an additional $2 more? So you're always trying to measure this stuff, and you're going to see this constantly in any economic development study, and it's never explained well on television, and the best we can do, because it's a 20-minute show, is to simply tell you that this stuff is constantly never clear, and people sort of always try and inflate figures for themselves to make themselves look a lot better than they actually are.
And one of the easiest ways to explain the multiplier is one large variable. Yeah. That's then calculated by a bunch of other small variables. So you're essentially trying to take very few fixed costs or fixed variables and trying to then multiply based upon a bunch of smaller variables to get to a very large variable. So it's very hard to get that to be accurate, and even the best multipliers are never going to be correct. So they can be used to be a judge, but they certainly shouldn't be used as the absolute. But a safe bet is to say 2. Most people would say 2. However, if you look at most of the economic impact studies that are done, at least non-academically, they're at 3 or 4. Yeah. And that's nearly impossible. And you're really, like you said, you're talking about the money that's actually new and that's continued to be turned over locally.
Yeah, because there's so much economic assumptions that are made about this stuff, and a lot of times I know that one of the problems always seems to be that people are always overestimating exactly how much additional money's coming in, and I think what they're always messing around with is they sort of then assume, oh no, there's no trade-off. We're going to the stadium and we're eating locally at all the local restaurants, and you know that's not true. They're not eating at the local restaurants. They're eating at the stadium and getting in their cars and they're going home.
Right, and again, is it new or is it not new? And the other question is, okay, when you put in the figures of now the hotels are going to be at 95%. Well, what were they before?
Right.
Maybe the hotels were already at 95%. So again, you're not seeing an increase, you're just seeing the status quo. And with the Cardinals, quite frankly, you can't draw much more than the Cardinals. And the Cardinals you have to give it to them, have very good management and leadership, particularly going back to the new ownership group in Bill DeWitt Sr. in '96, and they brought in Jocketty and La Russa and Lamping and so forth, and that's continued with Bill DeWitt the third as the president. So they've had very good leadership and very good management that's translated to very good attendance.
Yeah.
But you can't really increase your attendance any more than they've done it, especially if you don't build any more seats.
We only have, well, we're out of time, but just to sort of give you the sense that, and you're going to see this frequently, it's very difficult to sort of figure out if you're getting your money's worth with something. And you try to hope you do, and there is some attempt to be honest about it, but it's always somewhat difficult to make these things actually understandable. Thank you for joining us.